All right, guys, so I guess I'm going to turn it over to the McCray now.
What we're going to do is we're going to do these in position, okay? That's the safest place to do it. I'll put them in here in order, so going back and forth between programs for them, okay?
Good to be back with you. It's been a while since I've been here. I always enjoy getting to visit here. And always want to open with a word of sympathy for having to work with David Estes. I'm sorry. Dave and I have been friends now for several years, and really enjoyed our time together at Yes. We have enjoyed getting to know a lot. Always look forward to an opportunity to come be with him here and with you. Let me say just a brief word about who I am, for those of you who don't know, and then in a moment, Mike will introduce himself. But my name is Rob McCray. I was a minister in Church of the Christ for over 30 years, I suppose, 35 years. Then I was executive director at Yes for about 7 years. That's when David and I worked together. And then now I'm working with Interim Ministry Partners, working with churches in transition. My father, John McCray, was a professor at Harding, Lipscomb, and Wheaton College for 25 years, and was a noted archaeologist. And so we got to travel quite a bit to the Middle East as a kid, including living there for a year when I was in high school. Continue to take groups back periodically. My brother, my father, takes groups of medical students over every year. Our families continue to be involved in Israel and Palestine for decades now. So that's how I come to be involved in this subject and interested in it and speak on it. Mike and I co-teach a class on Israel and Palestine at Lipscomb, as well as in churches. Normally when we teach this class in churches, it's 8 or 10 weeks. We're going to have to do a real condensed version because I'm already committed to teach a Wednesday night class at my church. I'm at Woodmont Hills there and as a member and an elder. And so I've already promised them I would teach the class this summer. But we may come back here this fall if you guys are interested in this subject and want to hear the fuller version of the topic. We'll try to work out something to come back this fall and tell you the parts of the story we won't have time to tell tonight. So certainly this has been in the news. Are we where we can throw it on the screen yet? No? Okay, we're going to skip that slide for now. This is obviously, the subject's been all over the internet, all over television, in the nightly news, saw it again tonight, watching the nightly news, and so we're seeing it all the time. We're seeing images of riots and violence and shooting. We're seeing protesters and Israeli soldiers shooting protesters, and we're hearing people blaming the other side. We're seeing images of the dedication ceremony at the new embassy in Jerusalem that the U.S. has just moved. And so it's all over the news right now. And periodically that happens in Israel and Palestine. Everything's kind of calm, nobody pays attention, and something happens and it's all over the news. So let me start by just asking, based on the things that you've seen and heard both now and over time, just kind of quickly, what are some questions that you have about this conflict between Israel and Palestine? Not that we're going to answer them all, we certainly won't tonight, but we're going to try to answer some over the next 3 nights. We'll be here in the next 2 Wednesday nights. What are some questions that come to mind when you hear Israel and Palestine, you hear the conflict? What are some thoughts? Yes? Should Jerusalem be recognized as the capital of Israel? Good. That's certainly all over the headlines right now. Others? What other questions come to mind? Yes?
Did not transfer it into a form readable.
Now, okay, so how did there come to be a modern nation of Israel? So there was an ancient nation of Israel. How did there come to be a modern nation of Israel? Good question. We'll deal with that a little bit next week. Yes? We'll deal with that question too a little bit next week, I think. Maybe a little bit tonight, probably more next week. Yes? Other questions? What's confusing? What's troubling? Should I have a question answered? What might it be? You're just here with an open mind to hear whatever we have to say. All right, well, we'll dig in. Mike's going to introduce himself, and then he's going to lead a little exercise that we usually do at the beginning of these classes that are kind of helpful for us kind of acknowledging where we are and how we're feeling in the room. So, Mike, introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. Yes, so I'm Michael. I'm Rob's nephew, the second son of the second son of the family. I don't know if that means anything, but I like to pretend it makes me special. Just really quickly on my background, and the only reason I think we tell you this is not in any way to kind of toot our own horn. It's to say this is a remarkably complicated conflict, and there are a lot of people who believe that they know a lot of things about it, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. But they all have something to say.
What would happen?
And we tend to say it very publicly. So we just want you to know a little bit of our own credentials, and so you can decide, do they actually have anything to say that I should be listening to? And you can decide that for yourself. So I've made 10 trips personally over the last 20 years to Israel and Palestine. As Rob said, the family's been going there since 1967, and collectively in the McRae family, we have each had 137 individual experiences over in Israel and Palestine. So we're well-rounded in terms of our experience there, ranging anywhere from archaeology to peace conferences, to medical field trips, to nonviolent direct action, to journalism, to storytelling projects, to Christian pilgrimages, all kinds of stuff. So I've been able to go 10 times starting in 2000 was the first trip. Rob's made 8 trips, so combined the two of us have 18 trips of experience there. I studied history at Lipscomb, focused most of my history study on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the political history of it. I then did a master's in Belfast, Northern Ireland, in conflict resolution and reconciliation, and again focused on my study on Israel-Palestine. And then we lecture at Lipscomb and around. This is our 6th church to do a class in, so we've been doing this for a little while. And I wrote a book about an experience, one of my experiences working in Israel and Palestine, which I do have some here if anyone would like some. It's called Letters from Apartheid Street. It's just to say, we've been around a little bit, and if you think that those things are worth listening to, those are worth listening to, then all we ask is that for 3 weeks this time, that you have an open mind to what we say, and at the end, you decide that you don't agree with it, like, you can do what you want with what we say. But it's just to say, maybe for 3 weeks, we can all have an open mind together and explore this really controversial and difficult subject matter. So, does that work for everybody? Are we all in agreement on that? Great. So, what we want to do is a little word association. So, what I would like to hear from you all, and this is one of the lovely things about this exercise, there's absolutely no right or wrong answer to this. Absolutely not. So, we're going to...
Unless you're wrong.
Unless you're wrong, you'd have to be
No, unless you lie.
Okay, so Rob's going to write up the words that we have with this exercise. This is a word association exercise. What we're interested in knowing is when you hear the word Israel, what are the words that you associate with that? Like immediately, what comes to mind? You hear the word Israel, and I know for a fact that something enters your mind. It's impossible for it not to. So just tell me, Promised Land. You hear Israel, we think Promised Land. What else do you think of? Absolutely no wrong answer. Say again. Conflict. Where Jesus walked. Jews.
Something we shouldn't do, but I'm going to do it anyway. So he can have that.
I know every one of you has something in your mind.
Imagine when I get my association, something pops in your mind. What?
You said Promised Land also? Yeah. 2 for the Promised Land. Promised Land's winning.
Where's media?
Yeah.
Is that media?
Chosen people?
Yeah. No, not select.
Yeah.
Media.
Just shout it out.
Chosen people?
It could be a color. I don't care. Anything that comes to mind.
What other words?
Palestine. Okay.
Palestine?
Jacob. Jerusalem.
Okay, there it is.
What else?
So what you're going to do,
Star of David. Star of David.
we're going to drag this over here when he gets ready for it.
Okay.
And then you got to make it big.
What's that?
Okay.
He only thinks he's stuck with David in it.
And then it gets ready. Then you get the next one ready.
What else? What's that? Arabs? Okay.
So he's got that.
You're hearing the word Israel. What are the words that come to your mind?
Pull that over.
War.
Make it big.
Wailing Wall?
Wailing Wall.
Back over here, so
Okay.
they're back into the deal.
Okay. Anything else?
You'll have to do this.
Prophecy. Yes.
Okay.
and then you come back into his
Okay?
deal.
When you hear the word Palestine, what comes to your mind? What's that? Oh. Gaza.
Gaza. I hear a lot of that lately.
Palestine, what comes to mind? War, yep.
War again? You hear Palestine, what words come to
What's
mind?
that? Islam.
Islam?
Anything in the back? Y'all think of anything? You hear Palestine? Hamas? Yep.
Hamas? Okay. Other images, pictures come to mind, words come to mind? What do you see when you hear Palestine?
Violence.
Pardon?
Violence.
Violence.
Sure, no, I mean, it can be nuanced. Violence, yep.
9/11.
9/11.
9/11.
The Quran. Yep.
Quran.
Terrorism.
Sand.
Say again?
Sand.
Sand? Like as in the material sand. Yeah, great.
Eraser.
There is sand. That's true.
Sand.
What else? There's absolutely no wrong answer to this. It's just what you think of.
Because whatever you think of is the right answer, because the question was, what do you think of?
Take a couple more.
What?
Say again? Jerusalem.
You also think of Jerusalem, okay?
6-Day War.
6-Day War.
6-Day War, okay? All right.
What else? A couple more. Politics.
Politics. It is a hot political subject.
Anything else? Barriers? Yeah.
Very.
Yeah, there are definitely barriers. So you think of camps also. Okay?
Like you mean camps, like refugee camps? Okay.
No, you're correct. Yeah, barriers and camps. Okay? Complete coverage? Oh, covering.
The
women.
the
Good
job.
job.
Okay.
Yeah, in Islam. Okay?
And when you say complete, you mean the one that covers the face and everything? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other pressing ones before we move on? What's that? Tunnels. Yep, thank you.
Tunnels, okay.
Yasser Arafat.
Arafat. Everybody's favorite Palestinian.
Okay, so another question. By show of hands, how many of you, when you hear the word Israel, have a decidedly positive, relaxed, warm feeling? You don't feel tense about it. You feel affectionate toward that word. When you hear Israel, how many feel some kind of
More or less.
positivity?
More or less a positive feeling when you
More
hear
or
the
less
word
positive,
Israel.
yeah, okay? Okay? How many, when you hear the word Israel, feel negative? Like you don't like talking about Israel, you don't like thinking about Israel, you have a negative feeling?
Few, some.
4? Okay. How many, when you hear the word Palestine, have a warm, positive, happy, relaxed, affectionate feeling toward the word Palestine? 1 person. I'm happy to see my hand. How many have a negative, aggressive, antagonistic feeling toward Palestine? You don't like...
Uncomfortable. Wow,
Okay.
lots of hands. Okay.
The reason why we do that is because, and just so you know, that same dynamic that we just saw, and the dynamic we'll name it is, most of you have negative feelings toward Palestine that you don't have toward Israel, right? That's very obvious by what we just saw. Okay? So I'm not projecting that on anybody, that's just what we saw by show of hands. You have a more positive feeling toward Israel than you do toward Palestine. Now, that has been true in every single class that we've ever taught about this in Nashville. So, it's not, doesn't make you unique,
In
right?
college or churches.
College, churches, anywhere, that's the same every single place. And so, one of the questions that we just want to raise is to say, why is it that is the dynamic that we see over and over and over again? That we have more positive feelings for Israel than we do for Palestine. Now, it may be because there are really good reasons to have more positive feelings for Israel. Maybe that's the case. But it is certainly true that it's because of the stories that we are hearing about that place. We are hearing stories that tell us that we should have positive feelings toward Israel and negative feelings toward Palestine, right? And that's what we're hearing in the media. Now, to say those stories may be very true, and they may be telling us exactly what we should know. What we're interested in saying is, what if there's also another kind of level or layer to this story? And that what would happen if we heard more of the story? Because of course the media can't tell us all of the story. There's no possible way. We only hear about it in the news every once in a while. It tends to look a little one-sided at times. So what's the rest of the story? So what we're interested in doing is to try and give you what we call a balancing narrative. So what we've seen here is that, it's hard to do with one memory, that the scales are a bit tipped right now, right? So we've got a little more weight given toward the Israeli narrative, a little less weight given toward the Palestinian narrative. So what we're thinking is, if we just come in here right now with a strictly balanced narrative, those scales are going to remain tipped. So what we want to do is say, well, we want to tell you maybe a little bit more of a story that you haven't heard, and see then at the end what you decide to do with that. If you think, oh, that was helpful and convincing, I changed my mind, okay. If you hear that and say, no, I hear what you have to say, it doesn't change my mind at all. That's totally your prerogative. Does that make sense? So we want to just try to give you a little bit of the balancing narrative, recognizing the fact that walking into it, if we walked into a room that was entirely in favor of Palestine and very negative toward Israel, we would do the class in such a way to say, well, maybe we should tell you a little bit more of the Israeli story, right? Because we're not interested in coming in and preaching to the choir. That's boring. We're interested in coming in and saying, what can we say that helps us complete and fulfill a maybe one-sided narrative that may be true and it may not be true. And let's see kind of at the end what we decide together. Does that make sense?
Because part of our concern is not in the end where you come down on issues in politics or foreign policy or whatever. One of our concerns as teachers is just that people don't know the one side of the story in America. And so that means that whatever decisions we make, they're often uninformed because we haven't heard the whole picture. And so we try to give people the whole picture. So we teach classes in college, we give them things to read on both sides and talk about both sides. So we'll try to do some of that in the course of the class. We just want to acknowledge up front that this is a very common thing that happens is people have only heard one side, and it tends to be a side that's very pro-Israel and very anti-often Palestine. Okay, the other thing that we're concerned about in this setting is not just the story, the history, although we've been asked to talk about the conflict, but it's also the biblical side of it, because often the questions that come to us as Christians around this conflict is, but what does the Bible say? So we see images like this, and those are images taken right out of the news for the last couple of days. And even those images speak to the dynamic that we just saw. On the one side, there's American and Israel together, friends, embassy in Jerusalem, flags side by side, everything's nice. On the other side, there's dead Palestinians, riots, this is a funeral procession in Gaza for one of the protesters that was killed. And that's kind of our image. We think of Palestine, we think of these sort of negative images. Conflict, protest, riots, violence, whatever. And we think of Israel as our friend. But when you start talking about this, for Christians, the question almost immediately in many Christians' minds is, but didn't God promise Israel to the Jews forever? So whatever concerns we have about these kinds of pictures, and they're very troubling, and anytime you see families grieving for loved ones, our heart goes out to them. We say, but the problem is God gave the land to Israel. And in this picture where Prime Minister Netanyahu is speaking at the ceremony, sitting right there is a Christian pastor who prayed at the event. There were a couple of Christian pastors who spoke at this inauguration. Both of them, I started to say happen to be, it's not happen to be, or by design, representatives of a viewpoint in Christianity that is very pro-Israel and claim that it was God's word, it was the Bible that gave the land to Israel, and Israel has to have the land for the end times prophecies to come true and Jesus to return and so on. So you will talk about a little bit tonight called Christian Zionism, and we'll talk more about on our third night. We're going to focus our third night on the Bible. Next week we're going to kind of focus on the history, the story. But we're going to do a little bit of introduction to some of that stuff tonight, and then we'll deal more with the Bible. What does the Bible actually say on this subject? But this is what we often hear is, doesn't God say Israel belongs to the Jews forever? So this is the passage that's usually cited, is from Genesis chapter 12. God tells Abraham, go to the land that I will show you, and that picture is actually the land that God was talking about. It's the middle part of what's today the land of Israel, and it's where Abraham first settled, was in these hills. It says, go to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you. Him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. One of the important things for Christians to remember is that the promise to Abraham was not just for Abraham. The real point was that God had a plan to bless all the nations of the world that's ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And so, but he makes this promise, and in the next chapter, when Abraham gets to the land, God says, lift your eyes and look from the place where you are, north and south, east and west. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever. So those who hold to the Christian Zionist view, which is a term that means who believe that the Bible and the Christian faith requires a belief that the land of Israel be given to the modern nation of Israel as part of the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. That's kind of a nutshell explanation of what that term means. But those who hold that view look at that and say, well, that's just flat out plain right there. I mean, how more plain do you make it? God says Abraham's offspring will get this land forever. Now, we're going to come back and talk about that a little bit next 2 weeks from tonight. But I want to point out something historical. That is true that that's what God said to Abraham, but let's look at what happened. Around 1300 BC is when Israel comes back and takes the land. Some actually dated a little bit earlier, around maybe 1450 BC, but that only makes this point even stronger because of the length of time. But we'll take the shortest point for now. That means 3,300 years ago, it's when the fulfillment of this promise began to happen. Joshua came back with the Israelites and they began to take the promised land. From the time of Joshua to the present, for 3,300 years, Israel controlled most of the land promised to Abraham for less than 100 years around the time of King David. Now just think about that for a minute. If that statement to Abraham means that the land of Israel is to belong to his offspring forever, why didn't God give it to them? They only controlled most of that land for less than 100 years around the time of King David. From the time of Joshua to the present, Israel controlled the heart of the promised land, which is basically what we call Dan to Beersheba, this section right in here. So the yellow is basically the land that was kind of promised to Abraham there, where he talks about from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, meaning the headwaters up here in the north, so this whole territory in yellow. They only controlled most of that in the time of King David and Solomon for about 100 years, a little less. But they controlled the heart of the land from about Dan to Beersheba, from the conquest with Joshua up until the time of the exile with the Assyrians, when most of the northern kingdom, most of the land of Israel was conquered by the Assyrians and they were carried off into exile, for only about 600 years. So out of the 3,300, Israel controlled the heart of the promised land for about 600 years. And from the time then when the rest of the kingdom was carried off, the kingdom of Judah, the southern kingdom, was carried off to Babylon in 586, to the present, the last 2,600 years, Israel only had an independent kingdom for about 50 years, shortly before the time of Jesus, until the modern nation of Israel. Now that means that if you take the words at face value that God said to Abraham, that your descendants will have the land forever, God didn't do it. So maybe we ought to go back and take another look at what God said. Because why is it that now that passage is being used to say they have to have the land now if they didn't have to have it 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago? Why now?
I just want to say, like, this part, I think it's easy to get lost in this part because you just heard a whole bunch of numbers, a whole bunch of terms. You know, there's a bunch of different places on the map that he's pointing to, and it can be easy to get lost if you've never seen this before. So it's just to say, remembering those dates, remembering the empires, it's not important. The takeaway is simply to say, if we read the text to say God gave land to the Jewish people forever, and we can also say historically they didn't have it forever, we have to ask ourselves then, what does that language of forever mean? Does that make sense? Does that train of thought work for you? So you don't have to memorize all this. It's just to say, obviously the Jewish people did not live there forever. So what did it mean if God said the land is yours forever?
So we're going to come back and talk about that in a couple of weeks. That's kind of a teaser. To say we're going to take a look at what the Bible promises and prophecies actually say about the land. But just as part of the teaser for now, up until the rise of Christian Zionism about 100 years ago, most Christians throughout history, far and away, did not believe that the land of Israel was going to be given again to the Jewish people. So that's a new way of reading the Bible that we'll talk about in a minute. Many would have pointed to a passage like this where God was speaking to Moses and said, if you do not obey, so Moses now is talking to the people of Israel because of what God told him to say. If you do not obey the voice of the Lord, all these curses will come upon you till you are destroyed because you didn't obey God's commandments. Therefore you will serve your enemies as the Lord will send against you. He will put a yoke of iron on your neck until he has destroyed you, and you will be plucked off the land that you are entering to take possession of. So this was right before they go into the promised land with Joshua. Moses warns them they could lose the land if they don't keep his laws. So many Christians for centuries believed that the promise made to Abraham was made in the context of a covenant. It was intended for a purpose. It had conditions. It wasn't literally meant, your descendants will have this land forever. We'll come back to that in a couple of weeks. But at least to see, there are some other passages that maybe suggest another side to that story than just God gave it to Abraham forever. Christian Zionism is a form of dispensational theology, which is a theology that argues that the people of Israel and the church have independent purposes in God's plan that have not yet been fulfilled. And so God has a plan for the church. He has a plan for the people of Israel. Those are independent plans. God is working them out, and they'll come together in the last days. In this way of reading the Bible, Old Testament prophecies concerning Israel have to be literally fulfilled at some point in time. No spiritual fulfillment, no symbolic fulfillment, no change where God says, I said that then, but now I'm saying that now. They have to be literally fulfilled at some point in the future, even if they've never been fulfilled before. The modern nation of Israel, then, is seen as a fulfillment of these Old Testament prophecies concerning Israel. So Christian Zionism arose before the modern nation of Israel was formed, but it latched onto that and said, this is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And the further point that they make is that we can't oppose the modern nation of Israel, because if we do, we will bring on us the curses of God because of what God said to Abraham, that whoever blesses Abraham, God will bless. Whoever curses Abraham, God will curse. So to criticize Israel is to be guilty of cursing Abraham, and God's curses will come on you. That's a major tenet of some of the Christian Zionists, which is part of why some of these folk are so reluctant to criticize Israel no matter what it does, because they say you're guilty of opposing God. Historically, Christians have had, this is a real oversimplification, but there's three kind of major categories of how Christians have viewed the land of Israel and the relationship of God to the Jewish people since the coming of Christ. One view is called, okay, two are going to come up here. I can't separate. Apparently I made a mistake in the PowerPoint. One view is sometimes called replacement theology. It's the view that God rejected Israel for rejecting Jesus. Many of you are probably old enough to remember preaching like that, because that was a common theme in a lot of preaching in churches of Christ and other Christian groups as recently as 50 years ago. In fact, my dad remembers regularly hearing sermons that said there will never again be a nation of Israel because God has rejected them. And those sermons stopped in 1948 because suddenly there was a nation of Israel. So sometimes we have to be careful what we declare will never happen, you know. But this view says then that the church is the new Israel, and God no longer has a purpose for the Jewish people. It's been over and done with. God has rejected them. No place for them anymore. Anti-Semitic Christians, people who are anti-Jewish, prejudiced against the Jews, often latch on to this theology as a way of reading Scripture. But not everybody who holds this view is anti-Semitic. They may believe that you should love and be kind to and accept Jewish people the same way you would any other group of people. It's just that these prophecies don't any longer apply. They believe that as a nation, God no longer has this special purpose for them. That came to an end in Jesus. So that was one view that was held by many Christians. Another view that I think is a better view is that the church fulfills and universalizes Israel. In this view, the promises and purposes of Israel are fulfilled in Jesus. He's the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. He's the fulfillment of the prophecies about the Messiah and King David and so on. The church is the fulfillment of the promises about, it's not a replacement of Israel, it's the fulfillment of God's purpose for Israel all along. That Israel was commissioned to bring the Messiah into the world, spread the gospel everywhere, bring Gentiles in, graft them into the tree in Romans 11. That God's intent was to create one new people out of all the peoples. And the Gentiles joined the Jewish people on the basis of faith in Christ. And so it's not that God's casting off the Jews. He wants the Jews to continue to be the people he loves within this family of believers in Jesus. And that view is sometimes called a fulfillment view, that the church fulfills the promises. So it's not that all these promises and prophecies are literally fulfilled in some ways, that they're spiritually fulfilled in Christ. He's the new priest. He's the Messiah. We are the new temple in the Holy Spirit. There's not going to be a physical temple, and so on. Then the third view is the one we were just talking about, and that is that the church is an intermediate dispensation until Israel is restored. And this view of dispensationalism, as it's called, is the idea that when Christ came, instead of the Jews accepting him, they rejected him. So God creates the Gentile church to work through them. And someday the Jews will be provoked to jealousy and will come back in, and then God's purposes will be accomplished. And so, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah, good.
For folks who maybe are visual learners like me, this may be just a real helpful way to think about it, that there's a covenant that God has with the Jewish people that's running one way, and then Jesus comes and starts the church. And so there's a separate thing. Over here. There's a separate covenant that starts happening that are running parallel to each other. So there's still something special happening with the Jewish people through God, and then there's something special happening with the church. So it's not that it grows from the Jewish people or that the church replaces it. It's that now there's something separate, and so there's two things happening. Does that make sense? Is that visual? No, that's what dispensational theology is saying. There's a separate dispensation now for Jewish people and for the church.
Hand me that marker. I should have put the graph on the screen for this, and I didn't think about it clearly. We'll do this again Wednesday. But in the first view, you don't have this. In the first or second view, it's that there's this X. God rejects Israel. That's the end of that in Jesus. And then you have the church, over here, something separate. But the better view, I think, the fulfillment view, is there is no break. It's that the church is the fulfillment. Christ is the fulfillment. God continues to work. I think that's the whole point of Luke Acts, is that the fulfillment of prophecy is happening in Jesus, and God's work is continuing through faith in Jesus. But we'll talk about that a little more later. So, what did I do? So that's just to say that what's happened in America, this is largely an American phenomenon, although you'll see it some in Britain, some parts of Europe, is that in the last about 50 years, this dispensational theology that's about 100 years old became very popular among TV preachers and certain segments of evangelicalism, and then spread, so that now many Americans just assume that the way to read the Bible, the way Christians have always read the Bible, is that the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament are going to be literally fulfilled in the future and are therefore happening in the modern nation of Israel. And what I'm trying to suggest, more than suggest, I'm pointing out, that's new. That's not the way Christians read the Bible historically. So that's another reason for us to step back for a minute and say, well, even though that's what we hear a lot in America and American churches, there might be another way to take a look at this, because there always was another way. This is a new way of reading Scripture. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but I tend to be a little skeptical when somebody comes along after 2,000 years of Christian history and says, I've discovered something nobody else has ever seen before. I wonder, really? How did nobody see this before? You know, so, all right. So what we want to do now for the time we have left, I know there's probably some questions. I'd like to ask you on that point in the Bible, kind of hold your questions for 2 weeks, and we're going to deal with those in a couple of weeks. Unless it's just something you didn't understand. You think I kind of lost anybody on there? Okay? So what we want to do now is kind of move in a little bit of the story. Because one of the things that we often hear is that this conflict between Israel and the Arabs goes all the way back. They've been fighting for 4,000 years, all the way back to Abraham. Now, I wish we had time to tell the whole story of the history from Abraham to modern times. We don't. I just want to say that's actually not true. The times of conflict between Israel and their neighbors have been relatively limited, especially for the last 2,000 years. Jews, Christians, and Muslims have, for most of the last 2,000 years, lived in relative peace. There have been some exceptions. One was when the Christians fought the Crusades. That was a pretty bloody time. One was the time of the Mad Caliph in Egypt, who persecuted Jews and Christians. But there actually haven't been that many periods of conflict over the last couple thousand years. The conflict that we know now really is only 120 years old. It really isn't fought over religion, although people use religion to kind of fuel the conflict. So what we want to do now is to start telling a little bit of the story about where this conflict came from, what caused it, why. It helps answer one of the questions that everybody's raising right now. Isn't Jerusalem the capital of Israel? Why shouldn't the embassy be there? So, well, what's the argument on the other side? You know, that seems fairly obvious to a lot of people, so why doesn't everybody accept that? So we're going to talk a little bit now about the story. I'm going to hand things over to our historian, Mike, and you want to put this on? Okay. I'll interrupt him with this.
Good. Can you hear me? Here we go. Is it working? Okay. When we've done this at other churches, sometimes we do this class in 13 weeks. When we do this at Lipscomb, we do it in a whole semester. We're going to try and do this in 3 weeks, which means that we won't begin to even scratch the surface of the complexity of this conflict. So I just want you to know that going in. I'm going to do right now a rapid-fire sort of history of the first 50 years of this conflict. And making this presentation, I cut 70% of my slides out, just so that I could try and get through it. So just so you know, even what I tell you this today is 30% of what I would normally tell a group. So I just want that to be clear. So where we're going to start our story, we're going to skip those videos because we don't have time. When we think about, even with this, when we talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in our classes, we say it's helpful to think about it in 3 different periods, historical periods. The first is what we're going to look at just a little bit today, which is the Zionist movement which is from about 1880s to the late 1940s, followed by a series of Israeli-Arab wars, which you'll all be familiar with: Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, the war in Lebanon.
And that period, by the way, is where this story started, where they always fight. They've always been fighting, because those of us who lived through that period seem like every few years another war broke out. And that's where that image came from, of this constant war in the Middle East.
Yeah. And then the last period is what we refer to as the Israeli occupation, which is from 1967 until today. That slide obviously is 3 years old now. And what we mean by the Israeli occupation is the Israeli control of the West Bank and Gaza. And it is, just so you know, it's not debatable that Israel is in control of the West Bank and Gaza. It may be debatable that you think they have the right to control it. Like that's up for debate. But it is not contestable that Israel has control over the land. That's just true. Just to be clear about that. So that's what we're talking about, occupation. So here, we want to talk a little bit about the Zionist movement. In other words, kind of getting to your question of how is it that Israel came to have this land? Where did this story start? And heads up, it doesn't start with Isaac and Ishmael. It just doesn't. I'm sorry if that's a disappointment, but it's not that old. Where we're going to start with our story is in 19th century Europe. So we're looking in the late 1800s in Europe. And what's going on at that time, I'll actually start there. Say, in order to understand what happens with the development of Israel-Palestine, you have to get your head around this idea, the idea of historic Zionism. I mean, is everyone familiar with the language of Zionism? You've heard it before? Show of hands, how many people have heard of Zionism before? Okay, half the group. So you really can't make sense of this unless you know what Zionism is. So Zionism, historically, is the desire for the Jewish people to have their ancestral homeland in ancestral Palestine, right? To be able to have some kind of Jewish home place in the place where they always, or where they had been before, right? So for, the Jewish people were driven out of the land in 70 AD, I think. The temple's destroyed, Romans drive them out, and for 2,000 years they lived in what's called the diaspora. They're spread all over the world, right? Everywhere. And throughout that entire time, Jewish people are keeping alive the desire to go back, right? In many of the prayers they would pray about next year in Jerusalem, always returning. My very first ever email address when I was like 10 years old was Michael McRae, NYIJ, for next year in Jerusalem. Like, I was just so in tune with that kind of way of thinking, right? This is the idea of historic Zionism. We want to take the Jewish people and return to the land of our ancestors, okay? Now, we're going to zero in now in this story in the late 1800s in Russia, where there were a lot of persecution happening. There's a lot of persecution happening with the Jewish people under a guy, his name is Tsar Alexander III. Not really important that you know him. But if you've ever seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, anyone ever seen Fiddler on the Roof? You will remember that there's a wedding scene, and the Russian soldiers kind of ride in and destroy the wedding, and then end up burning houses. And at the very end, the movie ends with all the Jewish people down in Antarctica leaving. And that's because of what are called the pogroms in Russia, the persecution of Jewish people. Now, that is not unique to Russia, and what the Jewish people seem to have experienced is that almost everywhere that they go, where there are people who are not Jews, they find themselves being persecuted, right? So it's not hard at all to understand why Jewish people might say, we would really love to have a place where people stop picking on us, stop, brutalizing us, stop raping us, stop burning our houses, stop murdering us. I mean, I certainly would want that. And what they're feeling is, well, maybe the only way to do that is to live in a place where it's just us, where it's just Jews. And this is kind of the idea that gives rise to this movement to try to create this. And so you have here this persecution of Jewish people in Russia in the late 1800s. And there are a lot of Jews in Europe at the time who really want to assimilate. There's this whole set apart thing. For many Jewish people, it's part of the scriptures idea of people being set apart. But there are a lot of Jews in Europe who said, we just want to be like everybody else. We just want to fit in. But there was also a lot of anti-Semitism in Europe, and a lot of people weren't in favor of that. And so there was this constant tension and constant resistance. And so this resistance from society to welcome Jewish people and kind of an assimilation way strengthens the desire of Jewish people to find a homeland that's safe. So then comes this guy named Theodor Herzl. He's a really important figure in the history of Israel. Anyone ever heard of Herzl? Theodor Herzl? Okay. So he's a central figure. He's considered the father of political Zionism. There's a mountain in Jerusalem. If you've ever been, who's ever been to Jerusalem? Okay. few of you, have you ever been to Yad Vashem, to the Holocaust Memorial? Yeah, well, if you've been there, it's on Mount Herzl. It's a mountain named after him. So one of the most important memorials within Israel is on a mountain named for this guy. So he's a journalist living in France at the time, and he's seeing around him the collapse of an empire that felt safe for Jewish people. It's falling apart, nationalism is on the rise, and so is anti-Semitism. So he's looking around saying, what maybe was a territory that was once safe for us no longer is safe for us. It's time to actually do something about what we've been talking about for so long. So he writes this book, this little pamphlet really, called Der Judenstaat in German, which means the Jewish state. And in it, he essentially puts out a blueprint for how we're going to do this. Hey, we've been talking about going back to Palestine, finding our Jewish state for a really, really long time. What do you say we actually do it? Right? That's what Herzl's doing. So he has in there, like, what would our language be? Because, by the way, Jewish people didn't always speak Hebrew to each other. They were speaking German or Polish or wherever they lived. So we will revive Hebrew. What would our flag look like? What would our currency look like? Where would it be? This is really interesting, because Herzl doesn't immediately assume it's going to be in Palestine. In Der Judenstaat, he outlines two places that they could go for a Jewish state. The first is Palestine. Anyone want to guess where the second one is? I'll be amazed if you get it. Anyone want to guess where his proposal is? We could either go to Palestine or we could go here. Argentina. Look at that. What if Israel was in Argentina? Like, how interesting is that thought? That's what he says, is we could try that. So the very next year, this was in 1896, the very next year, 1897, there's what's called the First Zionist Congress, where many of the kind of leading influential Jews in Europe all come together in Switzerland and say, let's talk about what this guy just wrote and see if we can make this happen. And at that time they say, yeah, we're going to Palestine. Like, forget your Argentina idea, we're going back to Palestine. Okay, so you're caught up with me so far? This is how this is really getting going in terms of taking a historical desire, Zionism, and making it a modern political movement. That transition happens with this guy, Theodor Herzl. So the question then is, how do we create a Jewish homeland in a land that has other people? Because what the leaders of Zionism realized at the beginning, and this is part of the story that doesn't get told very well, what the Zionist leaders knew at the beginning was that there was another group of people there. And you may have heard a phrase that goes, Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. In other words, here's this big piece of real estate, relatively small or big, depending on what you're talking about. Here's a piece of real estate that is empty, and here's a group of people that really need a place to go. And what do you know? It happens to be the place where they lived in 2,000 years ago. Isn't that perfect? The story isn't quite that simple. So there was another group of people that had been living there ever since, that had roots that stretched back 2,000 years, that were uninterested in leaving. And that's just true. You really can't debate that one either. Like, that's just true. The Ottoman Empire was in control of that from the 1500s to the 1900s, and their census data shows the large population that was there. There were Jewish writers in the 1900s who went to visit Palestine who said, almost every field here is sown, like there is a large group of people here. But part of the way that it was spoken of is to say it was empty, and the Jewish people came, and then Arab people moved in to try to drive them out. That part of the story just isn't true.
It wasn't densely populated, but if you kind of think about Middle Tennessee as sort of roughly equivalent to the heart of Palestine, and you take the population of Nashville and kind of spread it out on farms and villages and so on all across Middle Tennessee, that's what you're talking about. It was not uninhabited. There were towns and villages everywhere, and people with orchards and farms and so on all through the land.
Yeah. So I've got 5 minutes to finish this, and I'm going to try and be good about my time. So, this is Herzl, who I just told you about. This is what he writes in one of his diaries. He kept his very thorough diaries. He wrote this in 1897, a year after writing the Jewish state. We shall try to spirit the penniless population, referring to the indigenous Arabs. We'll try to spirit the penniless population across the border by procuring employment for them in the transit countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, while denying employment for them in our country. Both the process of expropriation and the removal of the poor must be carried out discreetly and circumspectly. Shh, get it done. Right, that's basically what he's saying. Because what he knew, and what he believed at least, was to accomplish what they wanted, which was a safe place for the Jewish people. They needed to be in a land that only had Jews. And again, it's not hard to understand where that thought might come from. Doesn't mean it's not a problematic one. One Zionist Jewish scholar said the great tragedy of Zionism is that it occurs in the late 1800s after there were people everywhere in the world. There were no more empty places, so no matter where they tried to accomplish it, they were going to have to drive somebody out of the land. So they said the tragedy of Zionism. So Herzl says the way we'll do this is we'll get the Arabs out by taking the land and not letting them work there, and that way they have to leave for economic reasons. And that is what starts to happen soon into the early 1900s. So over the next 40 years, usually I would have about 15 slides in the place of this one. Over the next 40 years, waves of Jewish immigrants are coming in from Europe and from around the world, settling Palestine. And by the way, it is called Palestine at that time. The language of Israel doesn't come in until May 14th, 1948. It was called Palestine until then.
Even the Jewish leaders who were going there called it
Palestine.
Palestine.
It's just what the name was. It's true that there wasn't a nation state, a formal nation state called Palestine, but the area was referred to as Palestine. So the Ottoman Empire was in control of it for about 400 years until 1917. As these Jewish immigrants are coming in, tensions are beginning to build between the indigenous Arabs and the Zionist Jewish immigrants. And the main reason the tensions are brewing at this time is precisely because they're executing what Herzl was writing about. As many of the immigrants are coming in, they're buying up the land that many Ottoman Empire absentee landowners who were living over in Turkey, but they owned the land in Palestine and Arabs were working in. They began to buy the land from these absentee landowners, and then they would kick the Arab workers off the land and say, you're done working here. We don't need your work. And so it's not hard to imagine, especially in this kind of culture where we're very sensitive to immigrants who are coming in, we feel like maybe taking our jobs. It's probably not hard to imagine why Arabs might have felt frustrated if they see an immigrant population coming in, taking their jobs and not letting them work, right? So that's where the tension really starts to build. And many would say this is the actual origin of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is where the violence, consistent violence between Israelis and Palestinians, even though they weren't Israelis at this time, this is where it starts. So then jump ahead a little bit. After World War I, Great Britain takes over from the Ottoman Empire. England's in control. It's called the British Mandate of Palestine, and they hold the land until the end of World War II. So we're just sort of jumping around here. So for most of, from 1915 to 1948, Great Britain is in control, and Jewish immigrants are continuing to come in, and tension is continuing to build between the Jewish immigrant population and the Arab population that had been living there for hundreds of years. Then a really significant moment is right when the British are taking over, there's this statement that's issued by the British Foreign Secretary, which essentially says that the British government views with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will do everything we can to make sure that happens. So here you've got now a major superpower essentially weighing in. One of the first times that they really kind of weigh in on this and say, there are competing claims for what kind of homeland we're going to have here. We, the British government, are in favor of giving the Jews what they want. Doesn't really matter what the Arabs want. We're interested in giving the Jews what we want. So this changes the dynamic really decidedly in this conflict, that you have Britain behind the Jewish people. So let me tell you this, and then we're going to wrap up. What do you think? Should I do the Ukraine Commission quickly or not? So, just if I was to sum this up, what this says, I just find it really fascinating. In 1919, Woodrow Wilson commissioned the first ever public survey of Arab public opinion throughout what was called Syro-Palestina, so Palestine and Syria. He sent a couple of guys over there named King and Crane and said, find out what the Arab people think about a whole bunch of stuff, but also about this thing called Zionism and all these immigrants who were coming in.
So this was the American president commissioning a study of this problem.
So these guys went over there, and this point I think is really interesting. When they wrote their commission report after doing their survey, they said that they began their study of Zionism with minds predisposed in favor of it. We started thinking really positive things about Zionism. We were in favor of this. But they said that the actual facts, what we saw there, have changed our mind. This is in 1919, okay? American-backed survey. They said there's a lot of stuff that we approve about Zionism, but it really needs to be greatly modified because this whole idea of creating a national home for the Jewish people, the only way that's going to happen is through violence. Like, they're talking about it in terms of economics, they're talking about it in terms of buying up land, and but it's not going to work. The only way it's going to happen is they're going to have to violently drive the people off the land, and we can't support that. It says here, the Zionists look forward to a practically complete dispossession of the non-Jewish inhabitants. No British officer thought this would work without the force of arms. And so they recommended that Zionism as a program be greatly reduced, and that the project of making Palestine a Jewish homeland be given up. This thing is really fascinating. This is in 1919. The Americans were aware of the dynamics there. Now, they didn't publish this for a while, because they decided it wouldn't be really good politically to publish this survey, so they sat on it for a bit. But just to say, there was a recognition early on that to accomplish what Zionism wanted to accomplish was going to require violence, and maybe we can't quite get behind that. So the next really big thing that happens, there are tons of actually big things that happen, but you all know about this. 1939 to 1945, there's a campaign to annihilate the Jewish people in Europe. Even in Poland, when the Holocaust started in Poland, there were 3.3 million Jews. At the end of it, there were 300,000. Just imagine that. 90% of the Jewish population of Poland wiped out. And at this time, a significant number of Jewish people immigrate to Palestine. And of course they do. They're trying to get out of Europe. And so with that huge influx of refugees and immigrants that are coming into Palestine, the people in power, this being the British government, decide we've got to figure this out. We've got to divide up the land somehow between the Jewish people and the Arab people. And so they put together a plan on how to do that. And that's what we'll pick up next week, as what was that partition plan, how did they think they were going to divide it up, and then what happens after. Because Israel is about to become a state in about 3 years, right, from this point in history, and we'll walk you through that.
One of the major things that you've been hearing in the news, if you've been paying much attention, don't just change the channel, is that a lot of the riots and protests going on right now in Gaza and among the Palestinians are around what's called Nakba Day. The Nakba, that's an Arab word, I don't know what that means, but it's the Arab word for catastrophe. And it's their word for what the Israelis call the War of Independence, or their Independence Day. So Israel celebrates this day in 1948. It's when the nation of Israel was created. But the Arabs remember it as this terrible catastrophe in which 750,000 Palestinians are driven out of the land. And so they have very different ways of remembering this event. But that's part of the passion behind the protest, is this Nakba. That's where we're going to start next week, because that's what happens immediately after the Holocaust. The Jews are flooding into the land. We've got to have a homeland. Look what these terrible things have happened to us. We need a safe place. And the Arabs over here saying, wait a minute, this is our home. What's going to happen here? And that's where the first war breaks out. And we're going to start with that part of the story next time. Did we go too fast tonight?
We did go too fast, yeah. So we're on favor of the fall class, it sounds like. Yes, we can do a whole series. It'll be great.
All right, guys. Thank y'all for coming. Come back the next 2 weeks. This is a lot of good stuff. I want to let you know that this will be on our YouTube page. I'll put a link through email and Facebook, so you'll be able to keep up with it. It'll also have all the slides as well in the bottom corner. Give us a couple of days.